It was a solemn scene that few in the assembled media corps were prepared to witness, the once effervescently assured Prince William, heir to the British crown, coming utterly undone before the lenses as he fought through halting gasps to share the emotional tolls surrounding his wife's harrowing struggle with cancer. There had been furtive whispers and inscrutable briefings on the steadily worsening condition gripping the Duchess of Cambridge in recent months, but never the full unvarnished intimacies of Catherine's escalating health crisis laid bare until this moment. As William took to the podium, his stalwart composure almost immediately faltered under the psychic weight of the disclosures to come. What had commenced with a steadying inhalation rapidly curdled into shuddering, grief-stricken exhalations as he strove in vain to verbalize the turmoils his devoted partner had been enduring. After several abortive attempts to forge ahead with scripted overtures proved futile, the regal facade seemed to crumble completely as William openly surrendered to the lacerating heartache of his wife's dire prognosis. My incredible Catherine has been struggling heroically with an incredibly aggressive form of. The prince attempted through shallow, tremoring breaths before his words completely disintegrated into fractured moans of consternation and visceral lamentations. As the tears began streaming down his ashen, haggard features in torrents, his sentences devolved into unintelligible murmurings punctuated only by plaintive, almost feral whimpers of primal anguish. Once seen as the very avatar of stoic sovereignty and ambassadorial restraint, the heir to Britain's eternal throne was now contorted into a shattered, emasculated husk, the anguished visage of cosmic hopelessness rendered in excruciating realness before mystified witnesses. "I apologize, I'm so very sorry, but I simply cannot." William continued haltingly amidst escalating paroxysms of lamentation that seemed to be clawing at the fragments of his fracturing countenance. For several excruciating minutes that felt like viscous eternities, the scion of the House of Windsor appeared suspended in a crucible of all-consuming torment, teetering between ricocheting from the podium and collapsing entirely into the gaping psychic void that his wife's dire medical crisis had precipitated. Each tremulous utterance emerging between racking convulsions felt like Herculean exertions of will. The once self-possessed prince who'd been groomed since birth for these high-stakes addresses now reduced into a haunting caricature of human frailty amidst unimaginable existential distress. It was only after being physically braced and gingerly guided off the dais by a corps of grim-faced handlers that even the broadest contours of Catherine's condition could begin filtering out in any coherent fashion. The Duchess, having been clandestinely hospitalized for several weeks at the Crown's medical compound after an advanced-stage cancer metastasis that had evaded detection during routine examinations and checkups, abruptly accelerated with life-threatening velocity. Though specifics on the disease's pathology and origin remained classified under strict palace protocol, those privy to the situation described a panicked race against time as experimental therapies and radical countermeasures were being feverishly explored in hopes of staving off all but certain fatality. It remains a terribly grave situation for Her Royal Highness and the entire family, with the princess-to-be now spending every waking hour encircled by a corps of world-leading oncologists and specialists as they labor to arrest the spread, described one such intimate royal source while being ushered through secured Westminster corridors. This nightmare scenario descended upon them all with such blinding swiftness that it shattered the very foundations of their existences. Just weeks ago Catherine was the very portrait of elegance and regal vitality, with not the faintest inkling of such physiological betrayal gestating within. Now, they find themselves in the throes of an all-consuming fight for survival itself. Even in the immediate wake of William's visceral public unraveling and vague admissions surrounding Catherine's dire struggle with cancer, a stoic adherence to discretion still governed any revelations on the precise nature of her illness. Whether the palace's reticence stemmed from preserving family dignity during this most traumatic of chapters or a fretful acknowledgement that any speck of prognostic hyperbole could catalyze a panic with geopolitical ramifications remained unclear. Regardless, it fell to tangential sources adjacent to the intimate inner circles, from former staff to medical professionals with past royal clientry, to facilitate in filling in the haunting silhouette surrounding the Duchess's fragile state. I remain barred by ethical obligations from expanding upon Princess Catherine's medical case specifics, of course, disclosed one such trauma specialist with a CV studded by previous tours tending to royal patients battling life-threatening conditions. However, I can attest from intimate experience that the indicators being flashed outwardly by Prince William's emotional disintegration conform with the most dire prognostic spectrums for the respective pathologies. While carefully avoiding any details that could risk breach of privileged patient confidentialities, the physician nevertheless imparted a haunting prognosis through the prism of Williams's anguished outbursts and visible pallor, characterizing them as the archetypal aesthetics associated with spouses and loved ones confronting the virtual inevitability of imminent loss and bereavement. When it comes to these most visceral varieties of cancers unleashing unfettered metastatic pathologies despite indiscriminate therapeutic countermeasures, the emotional and psychic tolls manifest in quite distinctive symptomatic signatures for the loved ones being dragged into the phenomenon's wake, the specialist continued in measured, clinical cadences. The sheer expressionistic violence of Prince William's presentation cues, the occlusive weeping, the corporeal convulsions and moanings of animalistic distress, the impression of an abasement deforming traditional notions of regal decorum and personal composure? These patterns reliably imprint at the respective event horizons of caregiver fatigue for oncological cases nearing terminal dissipations of mortality, a loved one arriving at the thresholds of total existential alienation bracing for the inevitable departure of their other. For a royal family that had ascended to heights of domestic popularity not glimpsed since the golden eras of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, the prospect of losing such a consequential member of its new generation, the future queen who had reshaped the monarchy's relevance and human resonance for the modern age, represented a severing, soul-rupturing blow of the highest archaonic magnitude. Rarely had a public viewing audience been more immediately confronted with the harrowing fragilities and primal fears underpinning the mortal coils beneath those exalted pomp-clad facades. And at the locus of this spiraling vortex of torment was Prince William himself, the eldest heir whose human anguish and cratering stoicism now became the rawest of prisms into the anguished vignettes unfolding behind palace cloisters. For as the coming weeks saw Catherine's conditions continuing to oscillate with bleak prognostications, the public soon found its most visceral windows were no longer through detached medical clinical analyses, but rather the living disassemblies of William's embodied emotional breakdowns during successive press updates. We've reached a point where few facades or vestiges of royal decorum seem sustainable over the sheer psychological carnage of this experience, the trauma counselor continued after being permitted attendance during one of the prince's self-care interludes between compounding media vigils. His outward integrity and composure aren't just fraying or incrementally eroding, they're undergoing active disintegration through each successive confrontation with his wife's seemingly inevitable trajectory. It's as if the spectral inevitabilities of mortality's advent are steadily supplanting William's own anchored selfhood through this prolonged stress horror. Indeed, the notion of William undergoing a fundamental shattering of personhood seemed to take on eerie literalism with each successively more harrowing public appearance. Where his initial sojourn before the microphones showcased a visibly stricken man struggling to maintain noble visages, the ensuing displays saw him regressing into primitive states of guttural, inchoate suffering. Racked by depersonalization seizures that contorted his chiseled features into chimeric grimaces of inconsolability, the heir apparent was said to frequently cycle through dissociative fugue episodes that left him amnesic between public updates or entirely cut off from external stimuli and human engagement. After